the centerpiece, the hub, to bring together practitioners, students, and faculty, all interested in cultivating flourishing in organizations and of organizations. And Positive Links is the series where we bring back researchers primarily in a 45-minute dose to give you some new and important ideas from the sort of the research front. So as is customary, when we start out this event, we give people, we invite people or request or command that they engage in a very short transformative exercise. And that exercise is we're going to give you 1 minute to stand up and go towards someone that you don't know, and we're going to challenge you to build a high-quality connection to them in a very short period of time. What's really important is that you don't overthink this. What is important is that you genuinely try. So I'm going to ring a bell, and that just means you're off. You're off to build a connection. And then when I ring, because you're going to be connected, it's going to be very rude, because I'm going to disconnect you. But it's going to change, our research has told us that it's going to change the capacity to think in the room. So our collective intelligence is going to go up just through this short exercise. So on your mark, get set, go. Okay, here's the rudeness. Here's the rudeness. Sorry to do this, but see, good job. Did you feel the energy go up? It's pretty remarkable. And hopefully you've ignited some kind of conversation with someone during this time that you'll want to hang out afterwards and continue the conversation after Ryan's talk. But I get to the pleasure of introducing Ryan, which is a total thrill for me, because I've known Ryan since he began in our PhD program back when, and I had the honor of being his dissertation chair. And I was thinking about what would be one thing I want you to know about Ryan as a scholar. And I think the word I would give you is courageous. From the time I first met Ryan, he was pursuing really important questions from a very different angle than usually most people in the field. And just to give you a taste, and this is really hard to do because the pressures in academia, like in most organizations, it's a strong culture, strong professional culture. In the organizations that you're in, there's strong organizational cultures, and they push for compliance and for you to fit a particular mold. And Ryan, the wonderful thing about Ryan is he's resisted that and resisted it very productively, so that I know when I get a paper from Ryan or anything he's written, I'm going to be really affected by reading it. Not only because of the ideas, but because of the change in mindset that happens after I read the work that Ryan does. So he's been on the faculty at Washington University, at Darden, and Brigham Young, and he's now at the University of Louisville, which is just such an interesting place, not only because of what they're doing in kind of the positive organizational scholarship realm, but Louisville is actually one of the most progressive cities, compassionate cities in the world. And so they're doing very interesting things at the city level. Just to give you a taste of the interesting work that he's done, His dissertation, which got into our top journal, was on flow, the concept of flow in knowledge work. He's also studied flow in newsrooms. He studied, I love this paper, courage as an organizing process by studying in depth emails and all the communications in Flight 93, right around 9/11. He's done very important work on human energy in lots of different capacities, and he has done now the second edition of a book called Lift that he did with his dad about becoming a positive force in any situation or organization. And please join me in welcoming back one of our very special own PhD students.
So one of the amazing, I gotta turn on my here. There we go. Can you hear me now? All right. Oh, it gets louder all the time. So one of the wonderful things about being introduced by Jane is how amazing she makes you feel. And the amazing thing about Jane is, like, if you ever were to go, say, to the Academy of Management meetings, you would see people flocking around Jane because, here's someone who's so accomplished and people admire so much. And yet she takes the time, like this last summer. So last summer I received tenure at the University of Louisville. It was a big event, but thank you. And yet, at the time, because of a lot of journey that went on before that, I wasn't really feeling all that excited or fulfilled about it. And Jane, who had already complimented me about it, still took the time to write a handwritten note to me that just, the things she took the time to think about and write just meant the world. And somebody who is that accomplished and yet still takes the time to take care of those little things is one of those people you treasure in your life. Now, as with many of my stories of my career, they begin with Jane. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I'm talking to you today about learning from success. So back, I can't remember the year it was, but in somewhere around the middle of my doctoral program here at the University of Michigan, Jane, I think, had probably just recently either taken me on as a research assistant or agreed to be my chair, somewhere in that vicinity. She recommended that I go down to Case Western Reserve University, actually stayed in Kim's house over this weekend, Kim Cameron's here, and went to a seminar run by David Cooperrider at Jane's recommendation. She said, you should go down and check out what this guy has to say about appreciative inquiry. And, I think there was a famous person who once said, that the sign of wisdom is actually following the advice of smart people. And so I took this advice, and I went down to Cooperrider's, and it was a seminar that he did just for doctoral students. So I went down not even knowing what appreciative inquiry was or why I was going there, but just went down, drove down with another doctoral student, and spent the weekend learning about it, and had a very interesting experience. Now, I learned this morning over lunch, I guess lunch, that's not morning, afternoon, over lunch with some of my colleagues in the Plus Lab, that even though I'm in a group that's familiar with a positive, it's probably useful to explain what appreciative inquiry is so you know where I'm coming from here. But David Cooperrider developed appreciative inquiry as a type of organizational change method. And the idea is that you go into an organization, and instead of trying to solve a problem, you identify what the positive result you want is, and then inquire throughout the organization to find examples. I'm going to push this down just a notch or two here. To find examples of where that already exists and how you can learn from it and spread it throughout the organization. So you might put people into groups and they interview each other. When have you experienced innovativeness, or when have you experienced compassion, or whatever it is you want to produce in the organization, and then you share and spread those stories and identify projects that you can build out of them and implement them in the organization and hopefully succeed in changing that organization. So I went down, and David Cooperrider, put us through a kind of intervention with appreciative inquiry, and I had two reactions. On one hand, on an emotional and an intuitive level, it felt powerful and meaningful, and I was like surprised how much I was moved by this experience. On the other hand, as my new academic mind was developing as a doctoral student, I also felt really skeptical. Something I don't know about this, right? And, does this really work? And, it seems like there might be some Kool-Aid to drink here that I don't want to drink and, whatever else. And so I had this kind of conflicting reaction. But I was struck enough by it that I decided I want to keep track of this and learn about it. And so as a result, I started keeping data on it. And I didn't know what to do with it at the time. So I just kind of kept data on that and other related things. And I'm going to come back and tell you a little bit more about that journey in a minute. But the place that journey led me to was to begin a new research stream a few years ago on the topic of learning from success. And in the field of organizational learning and of individual learning, success has not historically been looked on as a particularly positive thing because it tends to have a lot of negative results. Now, of course, that doesn't make us actually not want to pursue success. We generally tend to prefer that over failure. But when people experience success, there's lots of stuff you'll notice. For example, Danny Miller and Jim Collins have written popular books, that basically say, hey, successful firms tend to get really overconfident and overinvest in their capabilities, and then they're not ready when you encounter changes in the environment, and so they tend to fail, and they're not ready to deal with changes because they get too caught up in their success. There's research in the learning curve literature that says that if you actually separate successful experiences from failure experiences in people's learning curves when they try to do something, that they learn a lot more from their failures than they do from the successes. There's the hubris issue. There's Denrell has talked about how a lot of times when you see success out there, it's not actually anything you did or any motivation you had. It's just that you got lucky because you started before others, or there was other starting conditions that were in your favor. Learning from success is biased, especially when we sample on the dependent variable. For those who are statistically trained, you're not supposed to only look at that. Success fosters convergence, so you get a lot of attention around a particular area, but if you try to do anything divergent, you get tripped up by it. And all of these results come from what's basically small differences in arbitrary decisions. Because if you think, what is success? Success is simply meeting or exceeding some goal you met or that someone gave to you that you arbitrarily set. It could have just as easily been something else. And so it's this social construction that you say, oh, this is success, this is failure. And yet when people fall in the failure category, we berate ourselves, we feel like it's public humiliation, we have all these problems over this arbitrary experience. And so it raises a lot of questions for us. And it also probably raises the question, why on earth then, if success has all these problems, am I talking to you about learning from success? So I think there's 5 reasons, and this will be the focus of what I want to talk to you about today. The first reason is we need to learn from success because once you've succeeded, I presume you probably don't want to fail. And therefore, you have to learn from the experience you do have if you want to keep from failing again. So there's a maintenance problem that comes with success. The second thing is success breeds confidence. A third, opportunity and creative possibility, and I'll explain that more in a bit. Fourth, building on success, that actually we don't want to just maintain, we want to improve if we can. And then finally, I believe that this is central to building a positive organization, which is presumably a reason why all of you are here. So we're going to tackle these one by one, but in tackling these, I'd like you to do something with me as we go along. So if you have a piece of paper, a phone, a tablet, or something that you can take a note on, take a minute and just jot down what is a success that you would like to learn from for any potentially of these reasons that we just talked about. Is there a success that you would like to learn from in some way? And as we go through these different options about why you might want to learn from success and how you might want to learn from success, I'd like you to think about how do these different options apply to this for your efforts to learn from this success that you've identified. My hope is that by doing that you will then make it more grounded instead of just a theoretical exercise, and we'll be able to see how it applies. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I'd love to hear your insights or contributions. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions on what I'm asking? All right, a lot of brilliant people in this room. Don't have to explain a thing. Excellent. All right, so maintaining success. So people here at Michigan are probably familiar with the model that Carl Weick and Kathy Sutcliffe proposed about managing the unexpected. And the idea behind this is they went out and studied what they called high reliability organizations. And the idea of a high reliability organization is that you have a nuclear plant or an aircraft carrier or something where any failure could be catastrophic, right? And so as a result, in order for such an organization to continue functioning, you have to constantly maintain success. And the question then became, if we can learn from these organizations where maintaining success is an essential thing rather than a nice thing like it is in, say, a corporation or somewhere else, what can we learn from them about how they do it? Their answer to the question is that you have to be mindful, not just as individuals, but as an organization, in order to get reliable performance, and that you do that by constantly anticipating failure, by pushing for requisite variety, meaning we have to have the people and the processes in here have to be as diverse as the environment that we're trying to understand if we're going to be able to understand it, that you have to maintain a situation awareness, which means you're constantly updating what is going on in my environment so that I'm aware of changes as they happen. I'm committed to resilience, where resilience means bouncing back. So if there's little aberrations, then I've learned ways to improvise and come back from that. And then finally, I have to have a loose hierarchy. If you have a tight hierarchy where you can only do what the boss says, then when something happens in one part of the hierarchy, the people in that part of the hierarchy lose the ability to have a voice and adapt to something before that little thing becomes a crisis. Now, I think this is a brilliant model, and you'll notice there's no learning from success in it. It's actually learning from, the part of learning that's in here is learning from failure. It's anticipating failures. It's learning from minor failures that come up along the way, and it's very failure-oriented in the way it happens. And I think that's necessary. That's actually not a bad thing about this model. However, I think one of the questions that gets raised by a model like this is, how do you build these capabilities so that you can actually be anticipating failure, push for requisite variety, and do all these things? And the fact is that we have learned in the research on learning from success and failure that you have to have success because success is what reinforces the norms. Now, this hasn't been a part of it, but one of the things this suggests to me is that we could benefit from specific practices of gratitude if we want to continue performing well, where gratitude is a form of learning from success. So you could imagine having people who have the responsibility to create or co-create better, because it forces us to consider things more broadly, to co-create a comprehensive list of enablers. One of the reasons why is because the research on learning from success suggests that with failure, we're highly motivated to learn because we don't want to experience it again. But with success, we're not as highly motivated to learn because, hey, I already know what I need to know. Look at me, I'm successful. And so as a result, we tend to be less comprehensive in our learning efforts when we experience success. But if we have people or practices in place whose job it is to create a list of enablers to our success and to appreciate those, it first of all helps us to be less susceptible to brevity. It reinforces desirable norms that we just talked about, and then it builds cultural benefits. And let me give a specific example of this. I was once sitting in a large meeting where there was a panel discussion from a number of experts on a particular topic, and one of the experts in the room was the managing director of the Hay Group, which is a large and pretty significant consulting firm. And he told the story about a consulting project he was on with a corporation that had many businesses. And all of the CEOs of the businesses of this corporation were in a strategic planning meeting, and somebody made the mistake of putting a slide up that had listed every single business and what their performance had been over the past few quarters. And the reason it was a mistake is because the minute the CEOs saw this slide, they all started harping on the people with the lowest performance, attacking them, trying to figure out why they had such low performance. Now, you can imagine what was the response to that. Complete defensiveness, right? Everybody fighting back, all safety in the room leaves, everybody's upset with each other, and it starts to become a disaster, and the managing director starts to worry about, whoa, this whole conference may go to pot if we don't do something about it. What was interesting was his intervention. He stopped everyone and said, hey, hold on a second. And he pointed to the top 3 or 4, whatever number of businesses that had the highest performance, And he said, how did these guys get such high performance? But that one reorienting question, the CEOs in the room started saying, well, and they pointed out, first of all, some things that they had done that were good strategic moves. But they also pointed out, oh, well, look, they're in this industry which has a more favorable environment. And, oh, they have these resources that these ones didn't have. And by appreciating the full experience, the blessings, you might say, if you take a gratitude sort of perspective on what made it possible for them to do that, including their actions, but also including the environmental circumstances, they created a much less threatening picture for all the other CEOs in the room. By the time the conversation finally came back to the low performers, there was no threat because everybody understood that the low performers had other issues in addition to any bad decisions they might have made that needed to be taken into account, and they were then able to focus on learning and improvement instead of just focusing on those guys and what they did wrong and what's wrong with those, whether or not they should be replaced or whatever other threats there might be. These enable us to create the kinds of norms that I think make this kind of reliability possible. Okay? So you might think about what you wrote down, what's the success I want to learn from? If you're interested in reliable and maintenance, then how might gratitude coupled with the practices of mindfulness help you to learn from success in that situation? Number 2, confidence. So one thing that becomes very clear in the literature that differentiates between success and failure is that success affects self-efficacy, which is basically specific confidence. There is some measures out there of generalized efficacy, but Albert Bandura, who was the leading psychologist who introduced the idea of self-efficacy, and why he had to call it self-efficacy instead of confidence, I don't know, but that's what he named it. But he focused on specifically that confidence makes more sense by domains. And when you have success in a domain, you tend to be more confident in that domain. Initially, when I started working on a literature review of the idea of learning from success and failure, I almost didn't include this because I wasn't sure that motivation was really a learning outcome. That's just, hey, you have success, you feel more motivated. Until I had a recent experience. So one thing I've struggled with over the past number of years in my life is I have struggled with chronic insomnia. And I have tried everything. Don't tell me about your melatonin or your whatever else. I have tried everything, and I had no success, and it was never getting any better. And then about 6 months ago, about the time when I really started seriously diving into my literature review, I started meeting with a guy who had this sleep training program. And it's the first time I've ever seen real progress. I'm actually getting 6 whole hours of sleep a night. And yes, I said that facetiously, but I mean, that was a lot for me. And what was interesting about the sleeping program, he said the key to doing it was accumulating success, right? I was creating the conditions where I would succeed in my efforts to sleep at night. That bred the confidence so that I could then, do that routinely and regularly and perform better in that area of my life. Now, having had that experience, I no longer see confidence as just some natural outcome that happens out of success, but that it's an active learning process to build up confidence in those domains where we need confidence. And one of the effects of this is that, well, not one, but 3 of the effects is that when you have higher self-efficacy, your intrinsic motivation is higher. I'm more interested in the kinds of domains where I feel like I'm good at it. I tend to raise my aspirations. And performance sometimes is higher with self-efficacy, sometimes not. It depends on moderators, such as whether I also have the actual ability or if I have the clarity. But under the right conditions, it also increases my performance as well. Now, having said that, as we know from the slide that we had before about the problems with success, one of the dangers of success is overconfidence. But fortunately, there's also things that can guard against that so that when we develop self-efficacy that we don't become overconfident in those situations, one of which would be learning goals. Are my goals just about performance, or am I also setting goals to learn, which means that by the very goals I set, I'm acknowledging that there's still ways I can improve and grow and get better. Also, the same gratitude we talked about before, one of the things I've learned from my own experience of trying to practice gratitude in my life is that it's the only way I've found to be happily humble. Every other thing that humbles me in my life is usually pretty painful. But gratitude, if I actually honestly look to see things that I'm grateful for and express the gratitude or write, keep writing a gratitude journal or whatever it is, it actually brings me joy at the same time it keeps me humble. And so this is another tool we have to guard against overconfidence. Okay, a third thing, a reason why we want to learn from success, is continuous improvement. And so here, there's a couple of things. One is after-action reviews. So Shmuel Ellis and his colleagues in Israel have done a couple of studies about after-action reviews where they focus primarily on soldiers, but we also see after-event reviews in corporations and elsewhere, where they examine how soldiers conduct these afterwards, and they specifically look, do you include success and failure? What do you cover and try to make sense of in your after-event reviews? And what they found was the soldiers were looking only at negative events in the first study that they conducted. But then, when they ran an experiment where half of them continued to look just at negative events, and the other half of them looked at negative and positive events when they did after-event reviews, their mental models got more complex, and their performance grew faster than those who looked only at negative events. And so it was the coupling of the two that accelerated the learning for them. They also had a second study where they looked at that, and this time they looked at it more broadly, and if you don't include the failure, then after-event reviews are not as effective. So failure is important. Even if you didn't fail, it's still important to say, what could we have done better? What were the mistakes that we made along the way? And that's critical. So doing the after-event reviews, at least in the studies that have been done so far, need to have the failure, but they tend to be better performance if you include failure and success. And part of that is just basic comparison. We know just from statistical sampling that you need to look at both sides of the coin if you want to understand these things. Another thing that is interesting, though, is what the learning process is. So after-event reviews focus solely on your performance, whether it's your individual performance, your performance as a team or as an organization. You're trying to understand my performance and how do we get better from that. But it turns out that we also can learn from others' performance and from others' experiences. And so one of the things that happens is benchmarking. Now, benchmarking, academics have criticized a lot of benchmarking in terms of it being biased and leading to fads and these sort of things. And so David Strang did a number of studies with his colleagues looking at benchmarking and finding that that the cases in which benchmarking led to fads were under specific conditions. They did happen, but as long, for example, as firms were skeptical and slow to lose their current practices and skeptical about picking up new practices, then they tended not to engage in fads and to pick up better practices from benchmarking. What was even more interesting to me than that, though, is when they looked at companies that were doing benchmarking, they found that even with those constraints, companies tended to perform better by benchmarking simply by virtue of the fact that if you copied successful firms, then you had the benefit of the fact that the rest of the firms had already weeded out a lot of the negative events, so the very act of imitation made you more likely to perform better because you were copying from a smaller sample of practices that were tended to be more effective and more successful. The problem with it, though, they did those based on computer simulation studies to show how the process worked. Then they actually went out into the field and examined a company qualitatively, how do they actually engage in the benchmarking process, and found that although success, whether the success of a practice or the success of the organization, had some effect on what practices companies adopted from other companies, the fact of the matter is most of them paid much more to social or perceptual or political factors than success. They just wanted to copy ones with a reputation, or they wanted to copy ones that their bosses came from so that it would look good to their bosses. And so, in fact, if you're not disciplined about actually pursuing and imitating success, and you just follow along with the political whims or the political fancies of the time, then the benefit of imitating from successful practices is gone, and you don't get any of that benefit. So you have to be disciplined about the effort to learn from success, which can be quite a hard thing to do in many organizations. All right, so that's continuous improvement. Now, on this note, this last summer, my father published a book on the positive organization generator, and I believe, was that what you spoke on when you spoke in the Pos Links? Was this, or was it something else? You think so? Can't remember? Okay. Well, in addition to the book, we spent the summer developing, we meaning a student of mine who is a software programmer, and my brother and some others got together and built out a social media platform for learning and development. And we have begun putting tools on it. And one of the tools that we put on it is the positive organization generator, which is specifically taking practices which have been successful, and so in this case, doing some of the work for you already so you don't have to go out looking for it, and helping people identify, here's what my organization is, here's some practices I can look at that have been successful elsewhere, and that you can actually go and read and find the ones that make sense that you can reinvent and install in your own organization. And so if that's helpful and of interest, there's a whole variety of different kinds of things there that are available for this imitation process that people can start. All right, the fourth reason, creative possibility. So I've been working on a project, and this one, the results have been analyzed, but we still have a lot of writing and getting critiques from our colleagues to do. So I want you to please take this first one as preliminary and not a final result, but it's an encouraging one that my colleagues are excited about. So Shirley Kopelman, who's here at the University of Michigan, and Chris Myers, who's a recently graduated PhD from the University of Michigan, and also Stephanie Simmons, who is in all kinds of different organizations here around Ann Arbor, but she's an emergency room doctor. The four of us got together and looked at the phenomenon of motivation to learn related to success and failure. And specifically what we did is we had emergency room doctors once a week read a story and reflect on it, and then we measured their motivation to learn and their performance over time. So we did this over 6 different weeks. And what we did is we had a third of them, a random third of them, read a failure story of something that happened in the ER. And then we had a third of them read successful stories. But then what we added to this was a third of them read stories of extreme success. So like somebody fell on a pole and impaled themselves, and normally there's nothing you can do about it, but this team of doctors in the ER got together, saved the person's life, and here's all the things they did, and it's this amazing story of how they pulled off this success. So the third group is reading these extreme success stories. And what's interesting about this is the research to date has all focused on this part of the curve, and has found that when you're successful, you're not very motivated to learn. But when you're unsuccessful, you're really motivated to learn, kind of what we talked about before. What we find here, though, is that there's another part of the curve. And that is, the more extreme the success is, the more the desire to learn increases again. And that desire to learn influences performance in the subsequent week. In this case, the performance measure we looked at was their throughput in the emergency room. So one of the things we believe that's going on here is that there's a threshold we have about what we believe is possible. And when people exceed that threshold, when I read a story from you where you've told me about something exceptional that you've done, I'm like, wow, I didn't even know that was possible. I want to know more about that. It raises my curiosity and makes me want to learn more. And so in that case, there's a benefit for actually seeking out exceptional stories, because frankly, it's a lot more fun to learn out of curiosity, out of exceptional things, than it is to learn from having to deal with failure. Now, that doesn't, again, we're not trying to eliminate failure. Learning from failure is a good thing, but this is an opportunity for us to actually look at, hey, there's things that are possible out there, and if we look for those possibilities, then there's opportunities for learning and improvement that come from that. Now, to add to that, when it comes to possibility, this literature is not explicitly from the literature on learning from success and failure, but when you think about it, people like Andrew Hargadon have studied innovation, and one of the fundamental assumptions in the research on innovation that I find to be very provocative is he says there is no such thing as de novo innovation. Right? If you think about it, any innovation you think of, you can think, wait, well, that came from here. Let me give a specific example. When I was at the University of Virginia, I had an office mate. It was not an office mate, but he was a colleague who was right across the hall from me. And he told me one day about a friend of his who was a brand manager for basketballs at Spalding. And this guy, his story had been written up, and so we went and found his story in the magazine and everything else. But what had happened was this friend of his arrived at Spalding, And he was put in charge of the basketballs, and he was told, all you have to do is maintain the brand. We have the NBA, the National Basketball Association's logo and imprimatur that we have on this. So we already have like 30 or 40% of the market share, whatever the number was. And he said, so you just have to make sure that we maintain and do well. All the innovation in sports equipment is happening in golf. The little way you change the divots on the ball, or the way the golf club works or whatever, people just pay all kinds of money for it, and there's lots of innovation there, and that's where they were focused in their R&D. And so for a while, he took that for granted and just accepted what they had told him. But there was one thing that always bugged him. And what bugged him was that whenever they did focus groups about their product, everybody had a story about how they had been at the park wanting to play basketball, and they couldn't because the ball was flat and nobody had a pump. And it always bugged him that they had no solution for this. This was actually probably 10 years or so ago. And he said, so one day, he was sitting at home for Thanksgiving dinner, and somebody put the turkey on the table. And as the turkey was sitting there, suddenly that little round thermometer that you have in the turkey popped out, letting him know it was done. And he had an epiphany. He said, wait a minute, what if we put the pump inside the basketball? And so he was all excited about the idea. He went back to work on Monday, and he told the first person, they said, that's the stupidest idea we've ever heard. And he told the next person, and they said the same thing, and same kind of results. And finally, he went over and told some of the guys in golf. And they said, oh, you know what you need? You need a prototype. And so they helped him put together a prototype with the pump inside the ball, and he took it back to show the basketball people, and they were like, oh, that's brilliant. That's the best idea ever. And so they did it, and the infusion basketball, when it came in, the year it came out, took them from, and again, don't quote me on the numbers on this, but it was something like from 30% to 60% market share in 1 year because of this. Now, what's interesting is that way they take the idea that it wasn't new, the basketball wasn't new, the pump wasn't new, nor was the idea of installing something new that came from the turkey. But in recombining it, it was a completely new product that enabled them to do something entirely new. And if you think about that, although they haven't labeled it this way, that's learning from success, right? You've taken a success. A pump was a success, a ball was a success, and now we're recombining those successes, and it opens up entirely new possibilities to us. Now, this is interesting because there's a little exercise. I won't do it with you guys just for the sake of time, but when I was at the Washington University in St. Louis, one of my colleagues was Judy McLean Parks. And she taught me a little exercise that I've done a few times in different classes that I've taught. It was a feedback exercise. What you do is you take somebody's object. Let's say I took Kim's journal here, and I asked somebody else to leave the room, right? So I say, Paul, leave the room where you can't see us, over there. So Paul leaves the room, and I say, where should we hide Kim's journal? And while Paul's gone, we pick a place, put it under the table over there or something like that. And when Paul comes back in, the group plays, hotter, colder, like you used to play when you were a kid, oh, hotter, hotter, colder, colder, except they're only allowed to give negative feedback. And you time how long it takes for Paul to find the object. Then you finish, Paul eventually finds it, Paul being brilliant probably does it in 3 minutes or something like that. And then we send Paul back out of the room. We say, okay, let's find another place. And we hide Kim's journal again. And it's in a different place. And he walks in, and this time, you're only allowed to give positive feedback. And Paul finds it in less than 1 minute. And I've done it multiple times. It always happens that with a positive feedback, you find it so much faster than with a negative feedback. Now, when I do this with MBAs, it boggles their minds. Because they've been trained on giving feedback. You sit down with your employee, you tell her what she's doing wrong, and then you give her all this instruction on how to do it better, and you be very political about it. You make sure you couch it in positive feedback, but does anybody really listen to the stuff that you put on either end of the sandwich and the positive feedback? No, but the whole time they're waiting to hear what the negative thing is that I'm bracing myself for. And yet, here in this exercise, negative feedback actually reduced performance, while positive feedback increased in performance. And the reason why is because positive feedback tells you what to do. Negative feedback only tells you what not to do. And so as I'm trying to get there and figure out what to do, I don't know what to do when you're only giving me negative feedback. I only know that I'm wrong. And that doesn't help me in finding this journal that I'm looking for. Now, here's the thing. In this scenario I just put you through, Paul already knows what the problem is. Paul knows that I have to find a journal. if Paul didn't know what the problem was, he would need negative feedback first. He'd need help in figuring out what the problem is. So it's not that negative feedback is bad, it's that negative feedback helps us understand what our problems are. So for example, when that learning curve research that I told you about earlier, where people learn faster from negative than from positive, it's because as I'm learning it, I don't know what all my problems are yet. And so I need the negative feedback to help me figure out what I need to improve on. But as I get to a point where I know what the problems are, the positive feedback tells me what to do. And so success and failure give me very different kinds of information. With recombination to create innovation, what it's doing is it's helping, and even with the search where I'm going and imitating others, what it's doing is give me solution options. And that's what the benefit of success is in those cases, and why recombining it can lead us to entirely new things. All right, now let me finish my story I started with you. So after I went to the Appreciative Inquiry seminar, I came back and started collecting the data like I mentioned previously. And this is the story of basically how I got onto this topic in the first place. As I collected it, there's a few things that I started to notice. The first thing that I started to notice was that Appreciative Inquiry wasn't alone. Over in the field of operations management, Eric von Hippel and his colleagues had invented this process called lead user process. And it was an operation management process for creating innovation. And the reason it was called lead user process is because you go out and find the people who are on the cutting edge of whatever it is you're trying to innovate around, and you ask them what they're doing, and you ask this person. So for example, if you're trying to detect early stage cancer tumors, then you might go out and say, all right, who is leading in digital imaging, because that's where the technology currently is. But as you continue to ask, how do you detect the ultra small, then you might end up going and finding out how the Army is able to detect things with satellites up in space, and you realize, oh, they don't use digital imaging, they use pattern matching technology. And then you realize, well, what if we applied pattern matching technology to detecting early stage cancer tumors? And as you do this, by going out and finding the ultimate successful people and then bringing them back into your common problem and recombining them, you come up with new innovations. Or in the field of social change, there's people who do positive deviance. And it's almost like exactly the same process. You go to Vietnam, you look around at all the poor children who are starving, and then you find a child over here who actually isn't starving. You find a child in that village who isn't starving, and you interview their mothers, and you realize, oh, they also add these roots to their meals that they make, or they give them 6 little meals a day instead of 2 big ones, or whatever else, and you start replanting those processes, and pretty soon you have entire villages where the children aren't starving anymore. And so I began to say, wait a minute, if this same process is popping up in different places where we're actually going out and learning from success and using these successes to spread around the practices, then there's got to be something going on here, right? Maybe, you know, there's something that's not perfect about it, but that this is converging evidence. And so it increased my curiosity trying to figure out what's going on. The reason I was skeptical, though, was because I was statistics trained both in undergrad, and then I learned even more statistics, and all this learning only from success, and Cooper Ryder in particular, you know, says, you know, you only focus on the positive, ignore the negative, just defied all of my training in statistics, where you do not sample on the dependent variable. So if you're not familiar with that, basic idea of sampling on the dependent variable is if you collect a random sample of cases. So in this case, let's imagine that we're trying to create some positive outcome, compassion on the y-axis. And I'm trying to guess what causes increased compassion in my organization. Then I might say potential cause is creating a compassion committee, and whether I have the compassion committee or not, and how many members should affect it, or something like that. And if I collect a random sample of all these things, then it might tell me, the more powerful my compassion committee is, the less compassion we get. So we better not form a compassion committee. That's all made up. Don't actually take that as advice. But the problem is that if all I do is I look at the successful examples of companies who have done that, and I say, do they have a compassion committee or not, then using those same data, but only using the successful one, may give me the completely opposite result. And so I go out and say, hey, everybody, form a compassion committee. And then they form it, and what I've done is I've given them bad advice, and they actually get worse compassion by following my advice by having sampled on the dependent variable. Well, that was my skeptical part, but it turned out that while I was here, the one other thing I picked up on by studying at the Center for Complex Systems here at the University of Michigan was I saw that people were creating mathematical models of various processes in nature, one of which included natural selection. Evolution is natural selection. And in fact, in these evolutionary models, they were doing things like taking that and using a computational model of natural selection to plot airline ticketing processes, or to do forensic face matching, or design pop music, and doing it successfully. And as I began to compare that, my colleagues and I, Brett Crane and Jared Harris, the three of us decided we should actually look into that more closely. And so we took David Cooperrider's book, The Handbook of Appreciative Inquiry, and we coded it so that you could actually get down to the bare bones fundamental essence of what is the process they're after and compare it to mathematical models. And we lined it up against the mathematical model for what happens when people sample on the dependent variable and said, what's the same and what's different about this? And then we lined it up next to the mathematical model for natural selection and said, what's the same and what's different about this? And what we found is that most of the process works, but you have to tweak some parts in order for it to have the kind of learning effect that natural selection would have. So here, instead of having, say, bunny rabbits or human beings or other people, reproducing and evolving over time, the thing that's reproducing and evolving over time are organizational courses of action, routines or practices or standard operating procedures that people engage in. And so if you look at that and you say, all right, what happens when we take survival of the fittest? Only the best practices for compassion or for innovativeness or for profitability or for courage or for whatever it is are the ones that we focus on. And then we take those, and instead what Cooperrider recommends is you say, what's common across them? And that's the one part that doesn't work as far as our analysis is concerned. Don't look for what's common on them, because that actually creates sampling on the dependent variable and all of the bias that we talked about a minute ago. But if instead of looking for what's common and trying to reproduce what's common, you take those practices and says, we don't care what's common. We're just going to take the best ones, and I'm going to take your practice you're running over here that's really good. I'm going to take his. I'm going to take these elements of yours and these elements of his and recombine them into new practices and try experiments and see which ones work. And over time, try these experiments and find out which ones lead to more courage or innovativeness or compassion or profitability. Then you're likely to have the same kind of learning improvements over time that you would have if you were running a computer program, but in this case, it's a human learning system that you can accelerate with these processes. So the important thing, though, is to there's a few points. That's the big difference. The other thing that Cooperrider does, it's consistent with the learning process, but it's something that's relatively new to the literature. In all of my review of the literature of learning from success and failure, nobody has examined the question about how we define success. But Cooperrider, from the very beginning, says, hey, when you encounter a problem, don't just accept it. Reframe it. Ask yourself, if the problem is sexual harassment, is one of the cases he gives, can you reframe it as creating high-quality cross-gender work relationships so that you're trying to create something positive instead of something negative? Well, this changing of our definition of what success and failure is opens up a whole new world of learning to us. And when you do that, and then you engage in an evolutionary learning process, then there's no end to building the positive organization. If a positive organization is composed of routines and practices and other interlocking courses of actions that make this organization unique, then by experimenting on those and recombining them in new ways where we're constantly learning and improving, then we can actually build our positive organization no matter what feature of positivity we think is important. One other, I can go into these in more details, but one other thing that also we found was interesting is that when people talk about the problems of sampling on the dependent variable, they're usually talking from a researcher's perspective. I go in, I collect data on all your positive examples, and I analyze it, and I get the wrong answer, or I get the right answer, luckily, or whatever it is. But all that's assuming that all the data I have is what I collected. But the fact of the matter is, when you run a process like this where you go with insiders and you ask the insiders, tell me your story of a positive experience with courage, and you tell me yours, and you tell me yours, the very act of asking you this question as an insider who has lots of experience in your organization, you have to separate the negative and the sort of positive from the positive in order to generate your story. So I, as an outsider, may be sampling on the dependent variable, but you, as an insider, may not be. You're actually making comparisons between positive and negative and coming up with better results because of that. And so one thing we need to be careful about is to not fall into researcher bias, because there are some things that maybe the practitioners are better at than the researchers are. And I think that's an important thing for us to consider. All right, so there are limits to all these things, but let me pull through. I had an experience back when I was telling you about this, the other tool that we put onto Lift Exchange on the software platform we've been developing is a learning from success platform. We call it Breakthrough. And basically the idea here is that it's evolutionary learning or appreciative inquiry or positive deviance or whatever you want to call it on a computer, so it's structured so we don't fall into our normal patterns of bias in learning. And it puts people through this process of sharing ideas and recombining them over in time so that we can learn. And that's also available on the platform. It came actually one day when my father and my brother were applying for a consulting job with a company, and my father was describing how they were using the process, and he used the word "like" to describe the selection process of how do you select which ideas to use. And suddenly I realized, oh, we could implement this as a social media product, and then it would be available. And so that's another tool that we've been developing. And hopefully throughout this, I've given tools to all of you that you can use. So let me return. I think that's the last one. At the beginning, I asked you to write down or to mentally jot or whatever a success you'd like to learn from. So we've got 4 minutes left, and Angie tells me that we run like a train and we always end on time. So with the 4 minutes, I've just given you, I don't know, probably 10 different tools for learning from success. Which ones work for you or don't work for you, or what questions do you have? And we'll wrap up with taking a few of those questions to end with. Yes, sir.
Question. What does it mean by creating a bulwark against brevity?
A bulwark against brevity. Okay, so that specifically refers to the gratitude practice. And so let me first say the temptation for brevity comes when we try to learn from success, because there's not as much motivation to learn from success as there is for failure. With failure, I tend to think and act and question more comprehensively because I don't want to fail again. But with success, I tend to take shortcuts in my learning because I'm not as motivated to learn. If a practice or a person or a group of persons are established whose role it is to look for the things that we should be grateful for about the success as comprehensively as possible, then we've created a bulwark to prevent us from falling into the trap of trying to learn without much comprehensiveness. Does that make more sense?
Very much.
Great, thank you. All right, any other questions? Yes?
People wanted to follow up to revisit, and is the write-up on this in Lyft, or how would the people follow up?
The write-up on which part?
Learning from success. The general process. Are you in the process of
I am in the process. So I have, basically, I have like 3 different research projects that I've finished collecting and analyzing data on, but I haven't written up yet. I have a literature review of every paper I've ever been able to find by researchers that's been done, but I only have the main body section written. I haven't written the whole paper yet. So all of this is very hot off the press kind of stuff in terms of my own academic work, and hopefully we'll have something out soon. Now, in Lyft, in the 2nd edition, we have one chapter towards the end of that book that describes this learning process that is kind of written for practitioners and not for academics. And so there is one chapter on there that describes specifically the learning from success process as an evolutionary process, and that one's available and accessible. But the rest of them are still coming, and hopefully will be available soon if all goes well. Thank you for asking. All right, last question from Kim.
So all sunshine makes a desert. So why even pay attention to all this sunshine? I mean, don't we need to have our lives balanced with trauma and trial and darkness and depression?
So who are you and what did you do with Kim Cameron? Absolutely. And in fact, in focusing on this, one of the reasons why I've focused on success is not because I'm an enemy of failure. I do think failure is absolutely necessary. We have to learn from it. And even in the best case scenario, it adds a balance to life. That being said, given the human propensity to favor the negative over the positive for whatever evolutionary reasons there may be, and by virtue of these 5 reasons that I think we have for why learning for success is a good thing, I don't think we'll ever be out of trauma or trial or failure. I think it will be there, and there's ways we can learn from it. So I am just trying to provide an alternative approach to saying, how can we learn from success? And maybe we could deal with just a little bit less failure if we learned from success. Thank you, Kim.
So I have actually 2 thank yous to offer from the group. First, we're to the Joneses, who I did not single out. Diane and Paul Jones have been financially supporting Positive Links since it began. And so please join in thanking them again. I really appreciate it. And then I have this image of Ryan at the first POS conference where he came out as the Energizer Bunny. You know that Energizer Bunny with the thing on his, and he's still the Energizer Bunny doing such important work. And here's another artifact for you, but it's just a small token of our appreciation. Thank you. Thanks. This is for you. Yeah, and so please come back and join us in March. We're looking forward to seeing you. Thank you for coming. And join food. There's food, healthy food outside.